Greetings, and thank you for joining us for another SANS ICS concept overview. I'm Don C. Weber of Cutaway Security and a Certified SANS Instructor. In this concept overview, we are joined by Aaron Boyd, a Senior Industrial Penetration Tester at Dragos. I reached out to the community to find someone that has implemented Windows SYSMON within a process environment. Aaron stepped up and came through with flying colors. He will introduce us to Windows SYSMON and provide us with practical experience for implementing it in a safe and effective manner. If you enjoy this video and the topics we cover on the SANS ICS concept overviews, be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment if you have a question about this topic or suggestions for future content. Greetings. Today we're joined by Aaron Boyd of Dragos Security. Aaron is a senior industrial pen tester over at Dragos, and I've asked him, I actually reached out to the community. I was like, hey, does anybody understand SYSMON? Has anybody actually implemented it within an OT environment? And Aaron reached out to me. He said he did have experience. We talked a little bit about it, and I'm really excited to have him here because he is going to talk about actually deploying SYSMON in an ICS environment. So I really look forward to it. Aaron, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and go ahead and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Don. Hello, everyone. Like Don said, my name is Aaron Boyd. I'm a senior industrial penetration tester here at Dragos. Don reached out to the community, as he said, asking if anyone's had any experience implementing SYSMON in an ICS environment. My background pre-Dragos has been mainly ICS security architect in oil and gas companies and manufacturing and aerospace, where I actually did, in fact, deploy SYSMON on all my Windows endpoints in my DMZ and lower levels in every one of those environments. That's a topic I'm super passionate about and really excited to show you its capabilities. So with that, go ahead and jump right in here. So first, answering the question, what is SYSMON? It is a Windows System Service and Device Driver, because as most of us know, when we start talking about the Windows endpoints on those lower service levels of the Purdue model, system integrators, implementers don't necessarily like when you install third-party software, third-party agents on these machines, whether it be voiding service contracts or any type of other service level agreements. Any introduction of third-party software tends to nullify those. But with SYSMON, it's a Microsoft binary, and because it's a service and a device driver, it's easy to kind of skate around those limitations. And another really cool thing about SYSMON is no matter how many times you reboot the system, it's always going to be resident any single time it reboots. And it essentially does these three things primarily. First is it's going to log anytime a process is created. That includes whether it's a parent process or a child process. So as a pen tester, we're always spawning child processes off of existing processes to hide our footprint on the environment. SYSMON can detect that type of activity and can alert you to it if you have it configured to do so. Another really cool thing it does is it logs when files are being created. Not only does it log when they're created, it tells you who created it, where it was placed, and when it was put there. So if an incident was to happen in your environment and you saw this file was created, it's going to help you pre-answer a lot of questions that incident responders have, saying, when was this file placed there? Who did it? And really help answer some of the questions in an incident response. And lastly, my favorite part about SYSMON is it's completely customizable. You can tailor it to fit your needs exactly. It's not something you just have to install out of the box. It does everything, because that's going to cause a lot of alert fatigue, which I'm going to talk on a little bit later, and really help you not juggle so many logs, as we know Windows Event Viewer can certainly do when you turn that on and you see 18 or 19 event logs for a logon. And that's really hard to parse that data.
Yeah, it was interesting. I saw a tweet out there by somebody, and I don't think it was anybody that was involved with the control environments. It was just general, but they basically called out Microsoft on Twitter saying, "Hey, when are you going to make SYSMON just a natural part of the operating system, just include it by default, rather having to install it separately?"
Exactly. I'm waiting for that answer too, because there's so many people that don't know about SYSMON. And when I say this is not only a great defense tool, but it's a great visibility tool, which I'll also talk on a little bit more.
Excellent.
So as I talk on what SYSMON is, I also want to talk about what it is not. And the one thing SYSMON is not is it is not a silver bullet. It is not the only albeit solution you should have in your environment. It's not the only solution you'll need in your environment. It's just another tool you can use to complement what's either already existing, if there are things existing in your environment, or things in addition to help you get started in the right place so you can start getting visibility on what exactly is going on your Windows endpoints. So with that, a lot of people ask me, why should I use it? I already use Windows Event Viewer. Don't I already have all the information I need? SYSMON gives you more granular visibility into what's happening in your environment. And I know there's numerous ways to do that. There's so many doors you can go down to get this type of visibility, and it's really tough to answer that question. So in talking about the 4 key points about SYSMON and why I recommend using it to gain visibility in endpoints, the very first one, like I said, it's also my most favorite part, is it's completely customizable configuration. You can configure it to look for exactly what you need and are looking for, and you can fine tune it to your environment. When you fine tune it to your environment, you're minimizing the impact utilization because you're not alerting on every single thing. You're only alerting on the things you want it to alert on. And that's going to help out with alert fatigue a lot when you're not going to have an incident responder or a SOC analyst or any type of SIM if you're using. It's going to reduce the amount of queries you have to build or run just to find information. It's going to tell you in your brain, I'm configuring this to alert on stuff that's not normal in my environment. If I see SYSMON alert on something, I should probably jump on that. Mm-hmm. And in fine tuning it, you have to ask pretty specific questions. What is normal in your environment? If you don't know what's normal, talk to your asset operators or talk to your personnel in that plant. They'll walk you through the process. They'll show you those processes that are running, the application names, the account names. So when you are configuring your SYSMON configuration file, you can exclude alerts for some of those account names or processes because they're normal. And lastly, it is a security-focused product. Like I had mentioned with Windows Event Viewer, it's going to log everything, no matter whether it's relevant or not. And it's really hard to correlate through those multiple logs when an event happens, if an event happens, when you have to chain multiple things together to paint the story. Whereas with SYSMON, you can see exactly what happened, when it happened, and who did it.
Yeah, one of the questions I have around the configurations, and actually why I wanted to, find somebody that has actually implemented this within an OT environment, is that whole question about configuration. Obviously, when we're talking about auditable events, you can turn it up really high in Windows, and that can have a utilization impact. There's a network impact that I know you're going to talk about in a little while. But are there good places to start, as far as configurations, so that somebody who's not familiar with Windows administration and even event logging, at least they can start gathering a little bit of information, get this in place until they can learn more and improve the configuration later on down the line? Is there defaults configuration settings or a community that puts them out?
Absolutely. So SYSMON by default will alert on process creation. You don't need a configuration for that. It's always going to tell you when a process started. As far as community configurations, there is a really great community provided SYSMON configuration by Swift on Security that I will make sure to send you the link to include in the references for this video, where their configuration is really a catch-all for everything SYSMON can grab. So talking network and system utilization, if you have to take that into consideration on the environment you're doing this, use that configuration in a lab environment that's not production, because like I said, it is a catch-all. It's going to catch everything. But the way it's laid out, and I'll also show it in the demo, is how that config is laid out to make it pretty easily readable. So you'll be able to tell what it's detecting, what it's alerting on. For example, I think it's fair to say every environment is going to be unique. There really is no one end-all, be-all configuration that's going to be relevant to every single environment. But for me, as an example from a prior life, I won't say the company name, despite people are going to do OSINT and find it anyway. But one of the configurations I had was I just wanted to know if there were any EXEs or PowerShell scripts dropped on this endpoint. I already know my firewall is going to do its job preventing any outside network connections. I already know there's no administrators on this machine. I want to know if a vendor is coming on site performing maintenance, loading binaries or scripts that they're not supposed to be. And SYSMON did actually detect some of this, and one of our third-party contractors got in trouble for violating our service agreement by using the PowerShell script. So SYSMON gave me that visibility that I otherwise wouldn't have had of a script being loaded and ran on that endpoint without SYSMON or another third-party software agent.
Yeah, so it's kind of just giving you that capability of not really having to know all of the audible events that are configured through a Microsoft security template, but also improving the the security specific events and ensuring that those are accounted for, logged, and there for you to follow up on. Would that be an accurate statement?
Exactly accurate, yes, sir.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Sorry, I'm sidetracking. Go ahead.
No, don't worry about it. It's a good conversation. I love talking about this stuff. It's awkward as a pen tester, being the offensive side of the house, why I'm giving people defense mechanisms. But I love having to think outside the box on engagements.
Oh, absolutely. And this is ultimately, in my mind, this is coming at it from a security assessment standpoint and a pen tester. Our goal is to improve these environments. If I have, we're not going to have any findings, but if we can produce events that the teams can identify as actionable, then we've done our job. We're producing those events, and now we're helping to demonstrate the efficacy of both their solutions that they've implemented, their controls that they've implemented, and also their team's processes. So absolutely, we should be doing this, and we should be making it difficult for ourselves.
Absolutely. So now that I covered what SYSMON is, what it is not, how it helps you gain visibility, next thing is, how do you deploy it? So before deploying it, we do have some personnel considerations we do need to take into effect first. The first being is we need to acknowledge the fact that alert fatigue is real. So whether you've only got one person, if you've even got a person to look at these logs, and that's not somebody doing it on the side, ad hoc, just an added responsibility as every job description has, right? There's always that last line saying in other duties as assigned. We have to take alert fatigue into consideration because we don't want to burn our people out. We only want them looking into what's relevant or what actually might be happening. We don't want to send them down any rabbit holes or make it to the point where the last 10 alerts I saw were nothing. I don't think this next one will be. So we want to avoid situations like that. And also, too many logs to juggle. With Windows Event Viewer, like I had mentioned, 15 to 20 logs of just a logon event. Why is that relevant? I don't know. But configuring SYSMON just to look for what you're looking for will just show you exactly the logs you should be looking at. And with that comes those targeted questions. What are you looking for and what should you be looking for? That's when talk back to your site personnel, your operators, find out what's normal, find out what's not. Think outside the box if you can. What is not normal in this environment where if it did happen, I'd say, that's not normal. I should look into this.
Yeah, and those, all of those other events, we have to remember, and we have to remind ourselves, and that's where like the administration and development side comes into play, and that a lot of people in the OT environment might not have. They've got experience around processes. They've got experience for industrial controls and for industrial protocols, ensuring that the business or that the process stays running. They're not administrators, and so understanding that Windows has all of these logs so that the administrators can troubleshoot certain things. And the fact that we as responders leverage that information to help us understand what's going on in there, that's an important distinction. And I think that the SYSMON events, that especially since they're less administrative, like what's going on for the admins and the developers, and more for what are the activities that are associated with events that give us information about the security of what actually occurred on that system. I think that's important, and it helps to alleviate some of the fatigue if we've tuned it properly.
Absolutely. So after taking the personal special considerations with personnel and fatigue and things of that, now we're on to the actual technical prerequisites. And the first thing I'll call out in reference is my brother in arms at Dragos, Mike Hoffman's Windows logging presentation he had with you, Don, where he talked about Windows event logging, how to configure a Windows event forwarder, how to configure the collector. And there's also a really great SANS white paper that he wrote about gaining endpoint log visibility in ICS environments. We're piggybacking off the Windows event forwarder and collector with SYSMON because we're creating a new Windows event log essentially. So with that, the Windows event forwarder reads the logs and forwards them to either a single collector or multiple collectors, depending on how you want to do it. For example, I had my parent collector sitting in my DMZ. I had another collector below gathering the events from the level below that, and so on. So it wasn't just one collector traversing multiple zones in the Purdue model. It was straight one-to-ones. And eventually that parent collector in the DMZ went back to another collector on our enterprise network, where I then had it forwarded up to a SIM. Keep in mind, this was about 73 natural gas plants. I had this configured. It wasn't just a one and done environment, unfortunately. So then talking about the Windows collector, that's where we're configuring this on the actual endpoints, where it's collecting all these logs to send them to the forwarder. And to alleviate having to do this all manually, we're going to use group policy objects, where we're going to apply special log permissions so that the service that runs, or the account used to run the service, has the right permissions to read this log and perform its actions of collecting it and forwarding it. We're going to configure the Windows firewall, because this does run on WinRM TCP port 5985 over HTTP. And then we're going to actually just configure the Windows event forwarding service. So it's just another thing you don't have to do manually on every single machine.
So, yeah, and Aaron, I've got a couple questions around this. So first of all, is this, obviously there is going to be a lot of consideration around implementing a centralized Windows logging infrastructure. Would you say that it's simple enough to do SYSMON at the same time, or should they get that logging infrastructure up and running first, and then start looking at how they can leverage SYSMON to increase their visibility?
I'd say it depends on the environment. If you've got the bandwidth and the infrastructure in place to support multiple machines, go ahead and get your infrastructure good to go. So that way, when you do have the SysMon config files ready to go, you've got it all fine-tuned, you're ready for production, you know it's not going to impact your system, you're good to go. You don't have to wait on any existing teams to build out the infrastructure for you if it is managed by multiple teams. Or even a Windows event collector could be just as simple as your laptop when you're at a site, if you want it to be just to validate or vet that the process will work and it's going to get you the data that you're looking for.
And then my other question is around some of the standalone systems. Obviously, this is associated with Windows systems that are a part of a domain, and a lot of our systems within our level 3 environments are going to be like that. But we're also going to have some standalone Windows systems, some of our HMIs and so forth. Would you recommend installing and configuring SYSMON on those for some to improve the local logging?
I still would. And for cases where it's a non-domain joined machine that can't leverage group policy objects, we can still have authentication done through certificates, where it can connect to this collector, but I wouldn't have that funnel up to the centralized collector. I'd have some other dedicated resource to pull the HMI SysMons and then have it forward from that single source. Okay. All firewall ruled off, nothing can access that internally. It's just going to forward logs. So that way you're reducing your threat landscape or attack surface on that by saying, I can't even get to this box unless I'm on site, because it's using certificate-based authentication, but it's still giving me the data I need. And there's an outbound firewall rule to still let those logs go through. So I'm still getting the data I need without really having to worry about the attack surface as much on those endpoints.
Excellent. Thank you.
Of course. And then before deploying SysMon, have your configuration file ready to go, so you can install it and deploy it at the same time. Because like I had mentioned with the Swift-on security configuration file, it's going to be the end-all be-all catch-all for every single thing possible. When you deploy SysMon, you really want it to be alerting on what you're looking for directly, because like I mentioned, we are looking to alert or circumvent alert fatigue and eliminate any things like that from happening. And then the ways you can deploy it, you can really do it different ways. So if you've got Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager, also known as SCCM, you can also do it through PowerShell locally if you've got PowerShell remoting enabled in your environment. Like we saw, WinRM is required for this to work. That does require the same port that's with PowerShell remoting. Or if you've got just local logon scripts, you want it to go grab the SysMon exe, and the configuration file could be stored on a domain controller somewhere that just runs automatically anytime a user logs in. It's going to pull the latest configuration file, or you can just do it manually off of USB sticks if you really wanted to. And with that, I'll go ahead and jump into a demo on the environment I set up for SysMon. I'll cover the domain controller with the group policy objects to configure it all, how I configured this as subscription service on the collector, and the actual SysMon config we're doing. So just bear with me as I switch screens here. Cool. All my VMs are still up, so I'm not a victim of the demo gods today. Knock on wood, it's still early.
And I do see it, so I will confirm that I see it, and I see you moving around in it. So.
Awesome. So a little bit of homage to Jurassic Park. Director Dragos, his kids love Jurassic Park. We were talking the other day about how Jurassic Park was playing in his local movie theater, and the company from Jurassic Park, InGen, was just stuck in my head for some reason. So that's the name of this domain environment for this demo.
Okay.
So talking about the domain controller, the group policy I created, when I created GPOs as an architect, I wanted to name them to exactly what their purpose was. I know some people, for lack of time or really awareness or anything, they just have one group policy object to do everything. But for troubleshooting, it really helps when you break down the function of the GPO, naming it according to that. So to start off, there's a built-in Windows group for event log readers, and there's a Windows service that runs as NT Authority called Network Service. This is the service that's going to actually go out and read the logs on the collector, send them up to the forwarder, and then the forwarder can send it up to another forwarder if that's how you have it configured in your environment. And then the Windows firewall, like I had mentioned, we're enabling WinRM, which is TCP 5985, to allow, because it has to run on that service for it to be able to go out and grab the logs. Notice on my profiles, I have it set to enable on domain and private. I do have it locally configured to disable that on public, just in case any of my machines ever do fall off the domain. I don't want somebody to take advantage of my WinRM being open. And then the subscription service, this is going to configure all of the collector endpoints to reach out to this server to send the logs to, or at least pull down the configuration file, which basically tells them, hey, I am the forwarder. Here's what I want from you. Here's the interval I want it. Gimme. And you'll see event log security down here with this really weird string that might not be recognizable. So this Windows account that we added to the built-in event log readers network service, that by default does not have permissions to where SysMon events are stored. So we have to configure this configure log access and configure log access legacy, which uses ACLs on the folder we're creating. And this appendage towards the end, the A0x1NS, is the network service account. So even though we added the event or the network service account to the event log readers, we still have to manually grant that account permission to read the SysMon event logs. And this string here is the native Windows SDLC for the location of where SysMon events are stored in the event viewer. That's always going to be the same.
So is this group policy provided as a part of SysMon, or, I mean, do you have to download it? Do you have to set it up manually? How would people start with this group policy?
So everything in this group policy is covered in the Windows logging white paper that Mike Hoffman wrote, and I think he's got it templatized in there. I can certainly share another version of it that includes the appendage of adding the network service account to configure log access, because that's really the only change we had to make that was different from what he did, because this account or this Windows event doesn't exist today. So all the admin templates and the domain environment doesn't recognize that location. So we just have to manually say this location's real, give the service account to read all locations, and then we're good.
Okay. Yeah, we'll make sure that that's in the show notes once again. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure thing. And then with the WinRM service, do not do what I did here, including the wildcard filter for IPv4 and IPv6. This basically says any machine can interact on my domain with WinRM. Because this is also like my pen test lab environment, I'm always spinning machines up and down. I don't want to have to edit a GPO every time I add something new. So just temporarily, I added the wildcards just for this talk, but don't ever do that. Always restrict the scope to your subnets. Don't allow just any IP to do it.
Because that, nobody ever does that within their environments.
No, of course not.
What's
this wild card mean?
Right, and that's a part of some of the things that we need to address in our control environments, because a lot of people will get this set up. They'll get this GPO set up in a testing phase, and they're like, "Oh, look, everything works. All right, deploy it like that because it works." Well, we still have to take some steps. We still want to take into consideration some of the things to reduce those capabilities. Like you said, instead of using the star here, make sure, even though we're using this for initial testing, we'll want to lock some things down associated with the locations where communications should be going. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
Exactly. And like as some of us might have actually done in our own careers, I know I sure have, deploying actual physical firewalls, something's not working properly. We temporarily put an any in there just to let it work while we figure out why it's not working. We're all human. We might have forgotten to go back in, change that any. So human error, always a thing, something we always need to be mindful of as well.
But that's why we do pen testing. So those are the situations.
That's why we do pen testing. Absolutely. And then just for good measure at the end, once you set all this up, WinRM will start up automatically going forward once you enable it. But just to be a second set of protection, I just also threw in this GPO. If WinRM is not started on group policy update or group policy check-in, go ahead and start it. Just for whatever reason, Windows does Windows. A patch might do something one day that interferes with something. This at least will tell this service to go. That is it for the group policy configuration for all of this. So now I'm moving on to our collector, opening up Windows Event Viewer. Under subscriptions, we're creating a subscription that's going to allow all of our endpoints to communicate to the server, say, hey, what logs do you want? How often do you want it? So you right click on subscription to create a new one. I already created one here. Name it whatever is relevant for your use case, especially just for scalability purposes in case you set up more than one subscription in the future. In my case, I just did one for SYSMON because I only want this subscription to pull SYSMON events more frequently than anything else. But if you've got things like log auditing or advanced log policy enabled on your domain controllers, for example, to monitor when an account gets locked out, or how many failed password attempts, I'm sure you might have a subscription for those too. You might want those a little bit more frequently. This way you're able to set up the time intervals to be more in tune with what your requirements are. So the destination log, you can point to wherever you want. That's just where it's going to forward the SYSMON events. Just by default, it goes to forwarded events. And now with the subscription types, you got two options. You got the collector initiated, which is where this server will actually go out and query and pull the logs off all the machines, which I tend to not like in ICS environments. I'd rather it be push versus pull, where it's going to be source computer initiated. So the source computer is going to reach out to this server and say, hey, what's the subscription you want? What do you want from me? I'll give you what you're asking for, and I'll behave about it. So being source computer initiated, now you have to add a scope for what computers you want to have this subscription be applied to it. There are groups you can do just to have all your machines do it, like domain computers or domain controllers. But for demo purposes, I just wanted this one machine to do it for the demo, just in case I have to spin up anything in between now and then, And that way I'm not getting a bunch of data that's not really what I'm looking for. And you'll see this advanced option down here, and that's where you can set the event delivery optimization and the protocol. The protocol can either be HTTP, which is the WinRM 5985, or HTTPS, which is also WinRM 5986. So even though WinRM, HTTP, unencrypted, it still uses Kerberos authentication. So it's not going to be a password passed in clear text. So it is actually okay to use HTTP as the protocol here. And for event delivery optimization, you got normal, minimize bandwidth, and minimize latency. The difference between these three things are something you really want to pay attention to. So for normal, it's going to, I actually have to pull up my notes on this one because I do not remember. So many things to remember, Don.
Oh, absolutely. That's why we have notes.
Okay. So for normal, it's going to send the logs every 15 minutes on a scheduled frequency. So no matter what, every 15 minutes, those logs are going to be sent. It's going to be kind of difficult to get that just-in-time event happening if something not normal is happening. Minimize bandwidth is for those environments where you might have a T1 or a cellular connection where you can't have that much traffic flowing through your pipe without something interfering with something. So for minimized bandwidth, that time frequency is going to be every 6 hours. And then for minimized latency, that is going to be a push method for every 30 seconds. So that's going to help in this case where I'm only going to be alerting on the stuff that shouldn't be happening. So it's okay to do minimized latency because this shouldn't be alerting. If it does alert, I need to know immediately. I shouldn't wait for 15 minutes because as pen testers, how much can we get done in 15 minutes? And then what can an actually sponsored adversary do where they got maybe multiple people doing this, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and you know, I mean, it's great to understand that, especially from a tweaking standpoint, when we are talking about, you know, how bandwidth is can be an issue. But certainly, we want, as responders, we want the information as quickly as we can get it. We'd like near real time as much as possible. You know, our Unix system syslog send the event as soon as it's generated. They don't have batched like this, but certainly in my mind, minimize latency would be the best way to go for most, especially the level 3 environments.
Yep. So once all that is set to go, you can go ahead, click OK. It'll tell you the subscription was created successfully. I see this machine. It should have no issues reaching out to me. We are good to go. So once all this is done, now we got to get to actually setting up, installing SYSMON and doing that configuration file. So for the sake of time, I've already put the installation file, which is really just a standalone executable for SYSMON on this machine. And I've already created a sample SYSMON config.
So is that an MSI that requires network connectivity, or is it all standalone package?
It's all a standalone package.
Okay.
So it's just an exe that installs the service, which is going to show services.msc, and a device driver that allows it not to be interfered with. If it does get interfered with for any reason, like the service stops, the driver is still loaded. It should still collect logs locally. And then once the service is restored, then it'll forward everything up.
Does it require reboot?
No.
Okay.
So I've already created a sample SYSMON config here. I highly recommend using Notepad++ because this is XML syntax, and it is a lot easier to read in Notepad++ instead of Notepad.
But once you have it on a system, you're going to be reviewing this or setting this up on another system. You don't necessarily need to install Notepad++ on every one of your systems that are out there.
That is correct. You just want to install that on whatever system you're using to create the configuration.
Okay.
So taking Swift on Security's example, SYSMON config, it was the end-all catch-all for everything. I stripped out and only included the stuff that I was most interested in. Like I had mentioned earlier, and on most of my endpoints, actually, I only wanted to know if something was added to the start menu or the startup programs folder, or if a file was created on the system that's a batch file, DLL, executable, HTA, even though I really hope there's not internet on these level 3 endpoints, but sometimes it does happen. and I hope nobody checks email, but sometimes it can happen. And then also PowerShell scripts. So with this config, it's going to alert on these things and these things only, in addition to process creation, because that's something that SYSMON will detect by default.
Awesome. Yeah, I like this toned down one. It's a great place to start, especially if you were worried about
utilization,
resource exhaustion, utilization on a specific server. Better to start low and then add things to it, as you're more comfortable.
Especially, like I said, that sample config also includes like network connections, DNS queries. I did not have DNS, for example, on those lower environments, and I knew my boundary firewalls were going to do their job in preventing those network connections. So I didn't really need SYSMON to look for those things when they're not going to happen. Or if they were happening, they were going to be unsuccessful, and I didn't really need another thing to tell me it was unsuccessful.
Which brings up a good point. I mean, you had mentioned about, when I think about this, I think about our management servers, maybe even our HMIs like we're talking about. Is this something you'd actually want to set up on your domain controller?
Definitely. Okay. Definitely. Especially in light of recent events with all the Windows, 0 days and exploits out there. There's actually going to be an appendage to my sample config file I'm going to show talking about print nightmare, because that is still super relevant. There's actually a company called Lares that threw out a SYSMON detection for it, and it's pretty accurate, which I'll also demonstrate in addition to this. So to install it, I'm just going to do it manually because I don't have SCCM on this lab, and I didn't want to script it for demo purposes, just assuming this is going to be manual until you get all your testing and vetting figured out. To install it, it's really just as simple as running the exe, accepting the EULA, because we all know it's not going to install without that. TAC-I for install installs the service and the driver, and this command also lets you pass the configuration file, which is just the sample configuration I did here. And there you see it installed everything. It loaded my configuration file with that schema. As SYSMON gets updated, that schema can change, which you don't necessarily need to worry about unless you want to expand on newer alerts being created that require a mapping to a newer schema. That's okay. You just have to edit that XML file and change the schema version. You don't have to update anything else.
Okay, awesome.
And then once that's good, we can navigate to our event viewer locally on this host just to make sure that the new event log was created, which it's going to be under applications and services logs, Microsoft, Windows, and then all the way down under SYSMON operational. So there's all the process started, process terminated, me loading up event viewer right now. That's a process getting created. So immediately you can see how real time it is here, right?
So how big does that file? I mean, one of my concerns is always how size. Windows starts with really, really small files. Do you have to go through and update the maximum size on that file?
I've never had to in my environment, and as far as I know, those are still running 4 years later, still haven't expanded. It all really depends on how much you're going to be alerting on, because if you're only going to be alerting on things that shouldn't be happening, these things are going to be relatively minimal. I also had a GPO that would go in and clear anything out older than 90 days on the server locally and retaining them longer on the collector server. So that way, whatever was happening locally was still being relatively minimal. Whereas my larger servers that I could put, multiple NASs or RAID arrays on, have terabytes upon terabytes of data, I wasn't worried about storage on those.
Right. Yeah. And, I'm always, hopefully hopefully these are being set up in the situations where the logs are being forwarded. In the cases where they're not, though, increasing those log file size is going to be an important task to do, and you might as well do it while you're actually updating this. There's a few other logs that I'd update the size on, especially if you can't remotely log.
Sure, absolutely. So now that we see SYSMON's working locally, we can just go to our collector and validate that it is receiving these logs. So here we can see the name of the machine,
Right.
process terminated, and all this good stuff. So now referencing back to my configuration, the only things I'm really looking for are when these new files get created or these new files get added. So for example, I'm a pen tester. I need to get something from my machine onto this machine. I don't have my central IC2. I can't do stuff in memory. So I'm just going to drop a script locally, or I'm just going to write it locally if I don't have SMB open. So just for the sake of testing, I'm just going to open Notepad and say, and why not do see Windows tasks? Because that's always a good folder to put stuff. Just name it temp.bat. All good. It's there. We see here new events available, and I'll just refresh that. We'll see here a new file was created. There's
Excellent.
the UTC time, which I know a lot of incident responders love to complement all the various time zones we see. The process GUID, if you really want to drill down into it, the process ID, the image, which is the application that was used to generate the file, the target file name, and the time it was actually created. So now just going back onto our collector, because I said collect it every 30, 15 seconds, it's already there on that collector server, and that would go up to my SIM or whatever centralized viewpoint I was using. So I'd get this alert and I'd say, what is this temporary batch script being put in C Windows tasks? Nothing should ever enter that folder. Right?
You're going to say, hey, integrator, why are you doing things that I told you not to do? That's what you're going to say.
Exactly. And it would do the same thing for PowerShell scripts or binaries. No matter where you put it, it's going to alert on it, and this is what it's going to look like. Or if you don't like this GUI view and you really want to look at the XML view because you're a masochist, you like hurting yourself reading the syntax, you can certainly do that too. So, like I had mentioned, here's that Swift on security config I was talking about, which we'll certainly link in the reference. And here's everything that they are collecting on. You don't need to be an XML expert. They were nice enough to include comments on these are what the event IDs mean. Here's what they're in reference to, whether it's an upload. There's also some MITRE TTP mappings in here. So if the activity does map to a MITRE tactic, technique, or procedure, you'll be able to see the name and the alert itself, which might help if you've got some mappings in your environment.
Okay. So did you use this larger config on some of the like the management servers and so forth within your level 3 environment?
I had this on my DMZ servers because those were the ones that were the prime value targets. I knew for me, those were the ones I had trouble. I had trouble sleeping on the lower level stuff, but knowing how pen testers operate, you start in enterprise and always work to find your way down. These were the ones that were the path to the lower level stuff. So I always tried to put more attention and effort on logging everything on my DMZ machines, just because they were almost rarely used. And if they were used, I wanted to know why they were used. And this was a good way to give me that visibility.
Usually they're a little bit, because of what they have to do in that middle, they're a little bit more robust. The network connectivity is a little bit more robust as well. So I can see how that would be help you justify to go ahead and do this as well.
Like in this network configuration area, for example, you got your netcat, your NCAT, your PSExec, your VNC, and there's ways you can customize this too. So if you have a third-party app that's not in this config, you just have to follow a similar syntax, just replace the executable name, and you're now alerting on that executable. So it's completely modular. It's not, if it's not in the config, you can't use it. You can completely modify any of this.
Right. And, and really this is the starting point, right? So adding things, toning it down, because there's some legitimate uses. I know some just got off an assessment where a vendor was using VNC, type VNC to have remote access to some Windows servers. So that might be something that is a requirement. So certainly these can be tuned and should be tuned associated with those requirements of your environment.
Exactly. And if you also use SSH in your environment, a lot of us know the default port for that is 22. But say in your environment, you have that running on a different port, you know that, you can just add a comma after the 22 and add that custom port, and it'll alert on that too. You can
Nice.
say, hey, I know this port's associated with SSH or Telnet or whatever other various protocol. You can name the destination whatever you want. That's what it's going to alert as in the log, where you're going to read, hey, I think this is SSH because you told me SSH is these ports, and you can customize it to whatever you want. It's also got proxies if you're using a web proxy, or Tor, where you might be a little bit concerned about that if you see Tor alerting going out, obviously. And then really the world is your oyster with these things. I know it can be overwhelming if you don't know the syntax, but like I said, they were nice enough to put all the event IDs and all the comments in here. Talk with your owners, your operators. You'll be able to fill in a lot of blanks, strip out what you don't need, and only alert on the things you want.
And that's why I really like your toned down starting point. Here's some minimum things that you could do that will provide a lot of value, and then certainly as people are more familiar with it, decide where you can have these more robust configuration files.
Exactly. And like I had mentioned, I tune this to my environment. Like here's the sample of files getting created that I referenced, and I stripped out a lot of it, as you can see. Like for example, I didn't need to alert if a new PowerPoint or Word document was being created because Office didn't exist on this system and there's nobody there to install it. So I don't really need to have an alert for that if I know it's not going to happen. Or at least it shouldn't happen. If it does happen, you're not going to get anywhere. So, and then as I mentioned with print nightmare still being relevant, LARAs throughout this config. So you'll see here, the syntax starts with rule group names. Think of that almost like firewall policies where you can name the policy and have all the criteria under it.
Can you increase the font on that a little bit? Can you increase the font on that a little bit? Yeah, that'll help. Perfect. So you can point that out again? Yeah.
So rule group name, think of it like a firewall policy where you name a policy and have all the criteria under it. It's very similar to that in SYSMON, the rule group, and then the contents for that group. So in this case, I don't have to copy the whole config because I've already got the syntax that the other config is a SYSMON config. I'm already capturing hash algorithms if I need to. I've already got check revocation if I need to. Event filtering is by default, so I just need everything under rule group. And then going back to my config, I'll just make an extra line under the existing closing rule group. You can put it under the existing one. I just like to break it out because at least I hope eventually this vulnerability will be fixed. And when it's been fixed for X amount of time, it's no longer relevant. I could just pull this out of the config and update it. So I'll just add that in there and save this config file, and updating it is as simple as running sysmon-c for config. Sysmon XML, we see it's validated with the schema and it's been updated.
Awesome. I really like this point, Aaron, because so many people are risk adverse to patching for security or even for normal patches. Everybody's saying how their environments can't be modified, and a part of the process that we teach at SANS when when we want people to take in consideration some of these vulnerabilities and how to address them is coming up with some type of workaround. Now, the workarounds don't necessarily have to prevent the behavior. If there is workarounds that do that and they don't have a negative impact on the environment, then absolutely those should be considered. But one of the workarounds could be alerting on this specific type of activity. In other words, if these events occur within your environment, you might not be able to stop them, but somebody should at least look into the fact that they were being leveraged against an asset to determine whether or not that was expected behavior, and just provide some more information around it. So I think this is an excellent example of some of the workarounds that people can and should be leveraging when they can't patch.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And like we saw with the file created, SysMon created a temp sysmon because we updated that configuration file, because as we know, when executables run, it'll put some cached version and app data, bury it somewhere until it's done, and then it'll remove it. So we saw I clearly did something with sysmon, and almost immediately after, we can see the event ID for the sysmon config state changed. So if anyone makes a config change to this and you're unaware of it, this could also be something that might be interesting to you. And like we also saw, we are capturing the hash of files if applicable. So if you've got a virus total subscription, for example, or you've got some checks against public IOCs, you can take these hash values that get identified and cross-correlate to find out even more if something is malicious or not. So now that I updated this config file, I'm going to go ahead and just take a copy of a PowerShell variant of Print Nightmare and run it to show you what these alerts look like.
Don't do it.
I do what I want. And I'll leave it to you if you want to include this script in the references or not. Blocked by antivirus. Well, that's good. There are ways of obfuscating PowerShell, so just because this public version of it is burned does not mean that it's no longer relevant. Just FYI, I didn't want to use our obfuscated version that we use for this demo. So now that I've imported it, I executed it. It all ran successfully. So now if we look at our sysmon logs, we can see this PowerShell script is created via Notepad and placed in this directory. It was saved. I can see that that script was executed because it was placed in the temp directory. And just following through our chain of events, I see this spool service just created a new driver called new in the spool drivers x64 directory. It just created a new driver called the mxdwdrv.dll file. It just loaded that file and preloaded it with the nightmare.dll file. And that was it. It just detected on print nightmare and it did stuff it should not have done. And going back to our centralized server here.
All those events are there, yeah.
It's already here. So imagine if I had this set to alert me every 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. The malicious person just had 15 minutes in the environment. I had no idea. Or even worst case, 6 hours, fully understanding there's going to be environments.
And that said, I mean, I do need to caveat that decision might be made because of some type of requirement within that environment. It's better to log it even if you have to wait 15 minutes. You want to get that information so that you can understand what happened. You might not be able to respond immediately, but you do want to know what happened, what led up to circumstances, and so that's important as well. Yep. But we definitely want to go with that configuration where it's sending the logs as quickly as possible.
Absolutely, and even just further analysis on the collector server, as we can see, it created the new registry entry. You know, default exploits always have some kind of hard-coded text, totally not malicious. Yeah. So obviously when you see something that says totally not malicious, it's a good indicator it is. So
it's fine. Fine.
So yeah, that was pretty much all I had for materials and the demo. I certainly hope it helps, and always available for any questions or anything. Anybody can reach out to me anytime.
Well, considering that, yeah, where can people? I mean, obviously, I'm going to have your links for LinkedIn and Dragos. I'm not sure if you're on Twitter, but just let us know. Let people know where they can reach you. Go ahead.
So I'm probably most active on Twitter from a community standpoint. My handle is at ICS_Blitz, which will also be linked here. I'm also always available at my Dragos email, which is just aboyd@dragos.com.
Okay.
And I'd be more than happy to help any way I can.
I'll let people get it out of the video, and I won't put it in the show notes. But
Yeah, I like your style.
other than that, Aaron, hey, this is a super important topic. It's one that I've wanted to do since the beginning because I know how valuable it is. My incident response background near and dear to my heart. And I want OT environments, people to start considering this, both from a security standpoint, understanding the events that are going on in there. But like I mentioned, this is one workaround that is absolutely viable for some of these things when we can't patch. So I really appreciate you going over this. I tried to get Mike Hoffman to do this, but I don't know what his problem is.
Throwing shade on YouTube on him. I like it.
No, Mike wanted to cover this with me, but certainly he would have been starting at, I think, at a lesser of an. He would have done it, and he would have done a great job. But your experience of doing this actually within an environment successfully, I'm sure it was. I'm sure the learning curve was impressive. You had a lot of things that, and actually that's a good question. So let's kind of end with that, which is when you were deploying this within an environment, what was the one of the biggest hurdles that you had to address? I don't want to stop without talking about that.
Sure. No, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I'll just say I am wicked jealous of the community right now, especially GitHub. This config did not exist when I was doing this. So I had to figure out the XML syntax manually. I had to read the Microsoft manual. I had to go through trial and error for weeks to figure out the right syntax to get exactly what I'm looking for and ignore the stuff I knew that wasn't relevant. As far as pain points, establishing relationships with the operators and the plants and facilities themselves was probably the biggest hurdle, because obviously anytime you got a new person coming in wanting to put hands on their system, there's always the question, what are you doing? Don't touch that. Every time you guys come in here, touch this, something breaks. So it's just building rapport with them, building their relationship, showing what I'm doing, explaining why I'm doing it and how it helps them really helped me drive that home to no longer have any roadblocks. I just always reiterated the message that I am not here to judge you. I'm not here to make fun of you. I'm just here to raise awareness, and I'm trying to make sure we can all go home at the end of the day. Because oil and gas, it's not saying it's more risky than any industry, but that's the industry I'm most familiar with. I've seen contractors without limbs, without fingers from accidents happening, and I'd hate to see that was caused by a cyber event, and I had something that I could have done to prevent it. So that's why I'm motivated behind all this. That's why I love being with Dragos. Having this huge platform, obviously SANS, we have a great relationship with SANS as well. And super thankful to be here today talking about it all, because it is near and dear to my heart. And I know many others as well.
Yeah, Aaron, that's why I do this. Hey, I really appreciate this. Thank you very much once again. And I know I'm going to see you out there. We're going to be interacting again soon. So you have a great day, and we'll talk more soon.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Don.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to another concept overview with the SANS ICS and Cutaway Security teams. Please let us know if there are other topics you would like us to cover in the comments below. If you enjoyed the content, please be sure to like and subscribe to the SANS ICS YouTube channel. This has been Don C. Weber of Cutaway Security. Go forth and do good things.